Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Descartes' Epistemology. Descartes is understood to be one of the, I think you could say, the founders of the school of early modern philosophical rationalism. What that means is that Descartes is going to locate the most fundamental truths for human beings in the enterprise of pure or otherwise a priori style reasoning. We talked last time about how the cogito is a good example of that. We designated it as an intellectual truth. So in other words, something that you don't need to learn through the medium of experience. You don't find yourself perceiving yourself. You don't find yourself as an object that you perceive in your external environment. Instead, it's an intellectual truth that the cogito, the identity that you are, is brought along with all of your individual thoughts or ideas. This week, we're going to help sharpen and clarify this idea by explaining Descartes' epistemology. That's going to include a clarification of the central philosophical or epistemological categories that Descartes utilizes, which are clarity and distinctness, as well as what he understands our cognitive faculties to be. So in other words, the sources of our knowledge, which Descartes understands as the imagination and the understanding. So let's get into it. Descartes, as you have probably already seen at this point, talks a lot about what he calls clear and distinct ideas. Now, clarity or clarity is the ability to say what an idea is about. So you have a clear idea if you can specify what that idea is. So if I point to, for example, a shadowy figure, but I can't identify anything really about that shadowy figure, I don't know what that shadowy figure is a figure of, then one can say that I have an unclear idea of this perception. Now, distinctness is a related but importantly different epistemological category that is more demanding than clarity. So you can have a clear idea that is nevertheless not distinct. The question motivating the epistemological category of distinctness is, can you exactly state the difference between one idea and another? So, for example, I might be out on a walk and I might see my neighbor's dog. I might have a clear idea of that dog in the sense that I can easily recognize it as a dog. But I don't have a very distinct conception of that dog, in part because I can't name what breed it is. I can't, identify the relevant markers to determine one breed as opposed to another. I just know it indistinctly, you could say, as a dog. Now, part of the reason why Descartes is a rationalist is because he values these two features of ideas so highly. In pure mathematics and geometry, these enterprises are taken to be sort of models for the clarity and distinctness of my ideas. I can exactly say the features, for example, of a triangle, and what features differentiate a triangle from a quadrilateral. This provides sort of, I think you could fairly say, a benchmark by which we can compare our own knowledge and experiences. So the better an idea is, the clearer we'll be able to understand it, and the more distinct that idea will be from other related ideas. Now, Descartes believes that we have two cognitive faculties. In other words, we have two ways that we come to gain knowledge and ideas for Descartes. The first is the imagination, and the second, the understanding. Let's talk about the imagination first. It's important to clarify that Descartes' conception of the imagination is not like how we use the word imagination in our everyday speech. So for Descartes, to imagine something is just to engage in the process of picturing it. In other words, perceptions, and not merely things that you make up in your head, are, for Descartes, imaginings. They form an image of that thing. Importantly, Descartes doesn't mean imagination or picturing in exclusively visual terms. Visual examples are, in a way, the easiest because human beings are highly visual creatures. But Descartes means any way in which I come to have a representation of something else, and I come to form, we could say, a mental representation of that thing. So in other words, picturing is expansive. It's meant to not only discuss vision, but also taste, smell, hearing, touch, etc. Part of Descartes' point throughout the Meditations is going to be that when we imagine something, we know it with a relative lack of clarity and distinctness. This is going to be an important point that we are going to investigate with some examples below, but it's important to just understand for now. Descartes thinks of the imagination, whose sort of paradigmatic mode is going to be ordinary cases of perception, are by nature unclear and indistinct. By contrast, the other cognitive faculty that we have, according to Descartes, is the understanding. And this is rule-based thinking. So, for example, when I know that the number 1 quadrillion is divisible by 2, I don't need to go through the process of imagining, picturing 1 quadrillion things, and then going through the very, very long and tedious process of dividing that picture in half to determine whether or not it's divisible by 2. Instead, I just know certain rules or features of what it means to be an even number, such that I can know ahead of time, without any mental images or representations, that 1 quadrillion is divisible by 2. And I can know equally well that 1 quadrillion and 1 is not divisible by 2 into a whole number. The understanding, therefore, utilizes the kind of rules-based thinking that we find in both arithmetic, algebra, but also geometry. Now, I would like us to look at 2 examples that Descartes brings up in the Meditations. One relatively early on, and one where we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but I think it's a really good example for us to consider. The point of both of these examples is both to demonstrate the clear difference between imagining something or picturing it and understanding it, but also to demonstrate the relative clarity and distinctness of understanding as opposed to the imagination. Now, let's start with our first example, which is really found at the end of the second meditation. And there's a good reason for why this example follows closely on the cogito argument that we examined in more detail in our last video. We're going to get more about this when we discuss Descartes' dualism, which will be a central topic for our discussion next week. For now, though, let's run through the example. Descartes, having discovered the cogito, realizes that the cogito is an intellectual truth. In other words, it's something that's discovered by the understanding. And he brings up the wax example when reflecting on the fact that he's discovered the foundational truth of his philosophical system using the understanding and not the imagination. And so Descartes brings up this image, we could say, of a candle, right? A candle that is currently burning, right? There are lots of sensory perceptual features of that. It feels hot. If I were to taste it, it would taste a certain way. It, looks bright because of the light. It, I can hear the crinkling and so on of the wick. And he notices these features, and part of these features of his perception is that they are constantly changing. And to illustrate this point, Descartes takes a nap and wakes up and examines the wax again. Now the candle is no longer burning. The shape, the size, etc. of the wax has shifted considerably. It no longer smells as it once did. And the texture of the wax is radically different than it was before. According to all of the sensory perceptual ways of coming to know the wax, it has changed. When we attend to our sense perception, or what Descartes would call our imagination, we see that the wax is a constantly changing stream of perceptions. Right? Some of which are related to my visual perception, some of which are related to my smelling, my hearing, my touching, and so on. And all of these features of the wax that we discover through the imagination change. Now, but Descartes also can seek to understand, why is it that in spite of the constant change of the wax, that I continue to identify it as the wax, right? In other words, there seems to be some one thing that is undergoing all of these changes that I can identify using my imagination. When I look for the common rule, or the thing underlying all of the changes that the wax undergoes, I'm utilizing the cognitive faculty of the understanding. And what I discover here, which will be a topic of much more extensive discussion for us next week, is that the unchanging, essential aspect of the wax is that it is an extended substance. In other words, it's a body, it's something that takes up space. That's what it means to be extended, is extended across space. And it's a substance, which means that it undergoes various kinds of modifications. So the imagination located all of the modifications that had taken place in the wax during this short period of time. And the understanding discovered the essential nature of the substance underlying these changes. And Descartes' conclusion is that the wax itself, its essential nature, that thing that's undergoing all of the modifications, is its matter. In other words, it's the nature of its extended substance. What we can see from this example is that the understanding provides more foundational kinds of knowledge. The modifications identified by the imagination are unclear and indistinct, right? If Descartes hadn't taken a nap, but instead had watched the entire duration of the candle burning and eventually going out, he wouldn't have really been able to identify the distinct gradations taking place in his sense perception. At some point, there are changes that are too small for our picturing imaginative apparatus to get a hold of. But the understanding provides knowledge that is both clear and distinct. It's clear in that Descartes has understood what the wax is in spite of its various variations, and it is distinct in that Descartes can now say the difference exactly between the wax, for example, as an extended substance, and himself as a thinking substance. With this example, Descartes has established both that the imagination and understanding are two ways of coming to know the wax, but also that the understanding provides more essential or more foundational, more clear and distinct knowledge than we receive through the imagination. Now, the wax example is a kind of sensory perceptual example, right? In the sense that we are, through the imagination, we're perceiving the wax, and then we're applying our understanding to that wax. We're trying to see what remains the same in spite of all the changes. But Descartes actually provides interesting and important mathematical examples of this difference as well that follow along the lines of my 1 quadrillion example I provided earlier. And for this example, we're jumping ahead a little bit. This example actually comes up at the beginning of the 6th meditation, but I think it will be very helpful for us at this point. And that's Descartes' example of a chiliagon. A chiliagon is a 1,000-sided polygon. So if a triangle is a 3-sided polygon and a quadrilateral is a 4-sided polygon, a pentagon is a 5-sided polygon, and so on, a chiliagon is that number up to 1,000. Descartes brings up this example because his aim is to show that we have a very limited ability to picture a chiliagon, right? So when I picture a chiliagon, or whenever you Google a chiliagon, for example, most often chiliagons approximate a circle, right? There are so many sides. Those sides are so small that they almost appear rounded out to us, right? And if I just try to picture a chiliagon, I can't really picture it in such a way that I can rigorously distinguish it from a 999-sided polygon, nor a 1001-sided polygon. I only have a limited capacity, a finite ability to imagine a chiliagon, and to do so wherein I can maintain the distinctness of the chiliagon against these other polygons. Hence, I've drawn a circle here to sort of represent what the chiliagon looks like when we try to picture it. Here we have a really concrete example where, according to the imagination, a chiliagon is both unclear, right? Just picturing it wouldn't really be able to differentiate it from a circle or from a 10,000-sided polygon or a 909-sided polygon, etc. And it's not distinct in that I cannot just from the picturing distinguish it from other neighboring polygons. Think, for example, about those competitions wherein you are asked to guess the number of marbles or similar object inside of a jar, right? Here we can picture a number, but in virtue of picturing it, we see it as an indefinite plurality. That's kind of what's going on, is that when we picture things, we have a very limited capacity to do so. The understanding, however, is different in that I can know various features of a chiliagon regardless of my ability to picture it. So, for example, I know that the amount of sides that a chiliagon has is divisible by 2, right? And this is just one mathematical example. I could have a whole bunch of other mathematical knowledge about a chiliagon that come purely from the fact that it's a 1,000-sided figure, and therefore I can adequately distinguish it from a 909-sided polygon or a 1,001-sided polygon. All of this is just to say that for Descartes is a rationalist because Descartes thinks that the enterprise of the understanding, which is the same thing for him as reason, is going to provide you clear and distinct knowledge. imagination or sensory perception is able to see things with a certain degree, a certain finite degree of clarity and distinctness. But the nature of a finite degree of clarity and distinctness is exactly that it's also a degree of a lack of clarity and a lack of distinctness. As Montaigne would say, our sensory perceptual apparatus is finite, right? We don't see, for example, or hear as well as various other animals, and my capacity to picture such things is really ultimately restricted by my sensory perceptual apparatus. I hope that this video will motivate some aspects of Descartes' view, namely his rationalism. In our next video, we're going to see how Descartes' rationalism is related to his belief that you can prove the existence of God by means of a kind of quasi-mathematical demonstration. I very much look forward to hearing what you have to say, and I will see you in the next video.